Hi folks, this is all the fruit, and here I have the common ivy, Hedera helix. I'm in Heidelberg, Germany, actually right opposite the famous Heidelberg Castle, and the ivy is growing here really nicely on a sunny wall with nice view towards the castle, so why not make a video here? Well, there is a good reason not to make a video about the ivy. It's horribly toxic. Everything, including the berries, is toxic for humans. The ivy is a very interesting plant. Whenever I'm doing excursions with students here at Heidelberg University, which is not possible at the moment, unfortunately, due to corona reasons, but whenever I'm doing climate change excursions with them, I always cover the ivy. Why? Well, it's a member of the family Araliaceae, which is mostly a tropical family. And despite the fact that the ivy can grow in temperate climates, it still has a lot of the features of a tropical plant. I mean, look at that. It really doesn't look like anything else that grows in Europe. Yeah, we are used to the way the ivy looks, but if you think about it, it doesn't look like any other plants around here. What do we have? We have trees and shrubs and herbs and grasses. And what is the ivy? Well, it starts out as a small plant covering the ground, then it starts climbing up the trees, and while it's on the ground and climbing the trees, basically its branches look, well, let's see, I don't have it here climbing up the trees or on the ground. Basically its branches with the leaves look more or less like this. The branches you can expect on the ground or climbing up the trees with their suckering roots, which I cannot here are some. Well, they look like this, but as soon as the ivy has established itself, usually on a tall tree or in a tall wall, it starts producing a very different type of branches with a very different type of leaves. Well, the branches on the ground, or the ones which are climbing up the trees, they are very, very soft and supple and bendable. It's basically like a type of vine. Well, it is a vine. It is a climbing creeper. But then, as soon as it's established on a tree or on a wall, it produces those much thicker, stiff branches. And this part of the plant starts acting more or less like parts of a shrub or a tree. That's really unusual for... sorry, I have a slight cold. It's really unusual for plants in temperate climates. That's more typical for like, strangler figs in the tropics, which start out as little epiphytes, then become a vine, and then become a tree. So this one starts as a little ground covering plant, then becomes a vine, and then parts of it become something like a tree or shrub branches. Also, it's evergreen. This is not so typical in temperate areas. Also, it's March. Basically, stuff is flowering, the leaves are developing, but almost nothing has fresh fruit. There are a couple plants around here which have fruit surviving from last year, but it's very unusual for plants in temperate Europe to have fruit in spring. It's also like a more tropical thing. This stuff just the ivy just doesn't comply with the seasons here in Europe. Well, because it's able to produce such a good antifreeze in its tissues that it can save its ripening berries throughout the winter. Basically, it flowers in late summer or in autumn, where there is a shortage of flowers. So, on sunny autumn days, you have like hundreds or thousands of bees and flies and other insects surrounding the ivy, surrounding each bigger ivy plant. And then it has those very durable berries throughout the winter and spring, at a time where there is almost no other fruit. Well, the berries are toxic for humans, but birds eat them. They don't seem to like them too much, but when there is almost nothing else, they will eat them. So the ivy is a really crazy tropical plant, which, just because it's able to produce enough antifreeze in its tissues, was able to adapt to the temperate climate of Europe. It's actually common throughout Europe, except for like big parts of Russia and Scandinavia, which are too cold for it. But there is another interesting thing about it. Before the climate change, like more or less before the year 2000, east of Heidelberg, it was very uncommon to see those shrub-like ivy branches with flowers and fruit anywhere east of Heidelberg. Basically, the western edge of the Rhine Valley, which is right here in Heidelberg. Well, the Rhine Valley is not in Heidelberg, this is the Neckar, but this is basically the edge of the Rhine Valley, the edge of Atlantic climate in big parts of Central Europe. Well, east of it, the ivy was basically a creeping plant on the floor of forests. And how did this ivy spread and preserve its population and multiply when only those older branches which grow high on the trees change from their vine-like state to a shrub-like state and start producing flowers and fruit? Well, the thing is, scientists think that for the last 5,000 years, since the last warmer period, I think it was the Middle Dryas, the ivy has actually never flowered in large parts of Central Europe, like in the eastern part of Central Europe and in a lot of the central part of Central Europe. For the last 5,000 years, it was only flowering in the western part of Central Europe and, of course, in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic west of Europe. But it managed to survive because it's not just quite resistant to frost for a tropical plant, but it's also quite tolerant to shade. So it managed to survive for thousands of years on the forest floor in Eastern Central Europe. And yeah, now with the climate change, actually the ivy is one of the best indicators for the climate change because it grows pretty much everywhere in Central Europe. And you can basically monitor, well, what did the ivy in a certain forest, in a certain spot look in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s, and then later in the 2020s. And the ivy will show you basically a graph of the climate change in this one location. And yeah, if you do this every couple kilometers, you can basically make beautiful maps of climate change throughout all of Central Europe and also other temperate areas where the ivy is present pretty much everywhere but not flowering due to climatic restraints. So a very interesting plant for the study of climate change. Yeah, but of course we're interested in the fruit here. Well, I have to disappoint you. Despite the fact that the fruit are available throughout all winter and that the birds eat them, they are not good for humans. They are horribly toxic. What was it? The toxins are something like alpha hederine or something like this. Well, basically they produce in your body, they turn into saponins and stuff like that. Saponins, yeah, it's the stuff that exists in soap, and eating soap is also not very healthy. There are also other toxins in the berries. I totally forgot what. I'm not a biochemist, so for me usually it's just important that the fruit is toxic and that I cannot detoxify it in order to use it. So for me basically this is a non-edible fruit, a very interesting plant but a non-edible fruit. Also, I'm a little bit reluctant to try them because it says that even 2 or 3 berries can cause nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, and like a handful or 2 can even cause very severe symptoms and death. But almost nobody eats a handful or 2 because they are very toxic to humans. So folks, a warning, never ever eat ivy berries. They are horribly toxic. They might even look like, well, they are not that blue yet. They are not completely ripe. When they are ripe, they might look a little bit like blueberries, but they are horribly toxic and you should not eat them. So now I will try one so that you don't need to try it. And I'll describe the taste to you. It's supposed to be so bitter that it's almost impossible to get severe symptoms from it, because almost nobody will eat more than 2 or 3. Oh, and also, by the way, you can also get contact dermatitis. That means that similar to poison ivy, but not as bad as poison ivy. That's why this is called common ivy, while the poison ivy, which is not closely related, is called poison ivy. But even touching this stuff can give you a rash, a milder rash than poison ivy, but still, maybe better stay away from it if you are afraid of rashes. So now let's try those berries. Bitter. There's also a very slight taste like the ivy smell. Also there is some sweetness and some savory taste. And the bitterness is not that dominant. The bitterness is not that strong. The bitterness is the dominant taste, but not that dominant. They are not horribly bitter. I've tried a lot of fruit which are more bitter. Let's try another one. Yeah, bitter, but not incredibly bitter. Well, yeah. Of course, ivy also has some medicinal uses, but because it's so horribly toxic, I would advise you not to use it as home medicine, but rather to leave this to your doctor. Yeah, not much else to say. A horribly interesting plant. I can talk about it for like at least half an hour, although I told you the most important stuff about it. But despite the thousands of fruit which are available throughout winter and spring, they are not edible for humans. Sorry for that, folks. So folks, stay tuned for a lot more fruit videos from the beautiful city of Heidelberg. And don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe.